In the untamed wilderness of 1870s Wyoming Territory, a desperate woman, clutching a worn letter, was about to discover her new life was nothing like promised. What started as a hopeful journey to marry a rancher took a shocking turn when she came. Face to face with 7 abandoned children and an empty house, Emmeline Turner wasn't your typical mail-order bride. For 6 months, she had spent her life corresponding with Ezekiel Mathers, a man who promised security and companionship, known for his kindness to those in need. When she encountered Johnny holding baby Lily in his trembling arms, she had no idea she was walking into a web of corruption and violence that had already claimed one life. Emmeline made a choice that would lead to a battle against the most powerful man in the valley. What began as a search for love and security would become a fight for survival and justice. The Wyoming Territory would never be the same after a piano teacher from Pennsylvania decided that some promises are worth keeping, even when they weren't originally made to you. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The stage. Coach wheels carved deep grooves in the Wyoming dust as Emmeline Turner pressed her face against the window, watching the endless expanse of prairie grass bend in the wind. Her heart hammered against her ribs with each mile that brought her closer. To her new life, the letter in her reticule had been read so many times. The creases threatened to tear completely through the paper, but she knew every word by heart. Dear Miss Turner, I am a man of simple means but honest work, seeking a companion. To share the burdens and joys of frontier life, my ranch sits on good land with a fine house, and I believe we could build something worthwhile together if you are willing to take the chance on a new beginning. Yours truly, Ezekiel Mathers. 6 months of correspondence had followed that first letter, each exchange revealing more about the man who would become her husband. Zeke, as he insisted she call him, had lost his first wife to fever 3 years prior, and spoke of his loneliness with a frankness that touched something deep in Emmeline's wounded heart. She had her own losses to carry, the memory of Thomas Whitmore, her intended, back in Pennsylvania, who had perished in a mine collapse just 2 months before their wedding was to take place. The grief had nearly consumed her, but Zeke's letters offered something she had thought impossible, a second chance at happiness. First time to Wyoming Territory, miss. The driver called down from his perch as they crested a hill that revealed a cluster of buildings nestled in a valley below, smoke rising from chimneys and the glint of a river cutting through the landscape. Yes, sir, Emmeline called back, smoothing her traveling dress and checking that her hair was still properly pinned. Beneath her bonnet, she wanted to make a good impression when she met Zeke. Though they had exchanged photographs, she still felt the flutter of nervous anticipation that came with meeting someone who might become the most important person in her life. The town of Cedar Falls was larger than she had expected, with a main street lined with wooden storefronts and several side streets branching off into residential areas. The stagecoach came to a stop in front of a building marked Wells Fargo Office, and Emmeline gathered her courage along with her carpet bag and stepped down onto the dusty street. Zeke Mathers' ranch, she said to the driver who was unloading luggage from the boot. How far might that be? The driver paused in his work and gave her a curious look. Mathers' place, you say? That's about 5 miles northeast of town. But miss, he scratched his head beneath his hat. I heard tell there was some trouble out that way recently. Might want to check with Sheriff Morrison. Before you head out there. A cold finger of worry traced down Emmeline's spine. What kind of trouble? Can't rightly say, miss. Just heard folks talking. You know how word travels in a small town. The driver hefted her trunk down from the coach. I can arrange for someone to take you out there if you're set on going, or there's a boarding house right down the street if you'd prefer to wait and see. Emmeline's mind raced through possibilities, but she had come too far to turn back now. Need transportation to the ranch, please. An hour later, she sat beside a weathered ranch hand named Pete in a wagon that creaked and groaned over the rutted road leading away from town. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly, and dust coated everything. Within miles, Pete wasn't much for conversation, but he did mention that he'd known Zeke Mathers for several years and thought highly of him. "Good man, Zeke," Pete said as they turned onto a narrower track. "Always treated folks fair and square, whatever trouble there might be. I'm sure it'll work out." The ranch house came into view as they topped a small rise, and Emmeline's breath caught in her throat. It was larger than she had expected, a two-story structure with a wide front porch and windows that gleamed in the afternoon light. Barns and outbuildings were scattered around the property, and she could see cattle grazing in fenced pastures beyond. But something felt wrong. The place had an air of abandonment. About it, no smoke rose from the chimney. No figures moved about the yard, performing the endless tasks that ranch life demanded. Pete seemed to notice it too. "That's odd," he muttered as they approached the house. "Usually there's someone about this time of day." The wagon came to a stop in front of the porch, and Emmeline climbed down, her heart sinking as she took in the details that confirmed her growing fears. The front door stood slightly ajar. Weeds had begun to grow up around the porch. Steps and a child's wooden toy lay abandoned in the dust. "Hello," she called out, her voice carrying across the empty yard. Zeke Mathers." The silence that answered her was broken only by the wind whistling through the eaves of the house and the distant lowing of cattle. Then she heard a sound that made her blood run cold, the thin wail of a baby crying. Pete heard it too. "Somebody's in there," he said, climbing down from the wagon. "Stay here, miss, I'll go take a look." But Emmeline was already moving toward the house, drawn by an instinct she couldn't name as she pushed through the front door. The crying grew louder, and she could hear other sounds as well, the shuffle of feet on wooden floors and hushed voices. "Hello," she called again, stepping into a front room that was furnished but showed signs of neglect. Dust-covered surfaces and dishes sat unwashed on a table. "Is anyone there?" A door at the back of the room opened, and a boy emerged. He looked to be about 15. With dark hair that needed cutting and clothes that had seen better days. He carried a baby in his arms, and his eyes were wide with surprise, and something that might have been hope. "Are you her?" he asked, his voice cracking slightly. "Are you the lady Zeke was expecting?" Emmeline's heart clenched as she looked at the boy and the baby he held. "I'm Emmeline Turner. I came to marry Ezekiel Mathers. Where is he?" The boy's face crumpled, and he looked down at the baby who had stopped crying and was now staring at Emmeline with large, dark eyes. "He's gone," the boy said quietly. "Been gone near 2 weeks now." "Gone where?" Emmeline asked, though she dreaded the answer. "Don't know," the boy said. And now other children began to appear from various doorways and corners of the house. A girl who looked to be about 13, with stringy blonde hair and a dress that was too small for her. A boy of perhaps 12 with a mischievous face, despite the gravity of the situation, and others ranging in, age down to what appeared to be a 4-year-old girl who peeked out from behind the older girl's skirts. "Who are you children?" Emmeline asked, though she was beginning to understand with a growing sense of dread. "We're Zeke's kids, the oldest." Boy said, "Well, not all of us by blood, but he took us in when nobody else would. I'm Johnny, and this here's Lily." He indicated the baby in his arms. "That's Clara." He nodded toward the 13-year-old girl, "and Samuel and Bethany and Willie and Hannah." 7 children. Emmeline counted them again to be sure. 7 children, ranging from a baby to a teenager, and no Zeke Mathers to be found. "Where did he go?" she asked. "Surely he left word." Johnny shook his head. "Just up and disappeared one morning. His horse came back without him, and we found this." He shifted the baby to one arm and pulled a crumpled piece of paper from his pocket. "It's addressed to you." Emmeline took the paper with trembling fingers and unfolded it. The handwriting was Zeke's. She recognized it from his letters, but the words were hastily scrawled, and some were difficult to make out. "Emmeline," she read aloud, "if you are reading this, then something has happened to me, and I am not there to welcome you as I promised. I cannot explain everything, but know that I did not leave by choice. The children are good children, and they need someone to care for them. I hoped it would be me, but if not, then perhaps you will find it in your heart to help them there. Is money in the strong box in my bedroom, and the ranch is profitable enough to support everyone. I am sorry for the deception, but I could not bear to tell you about the children in my letters, for fear you would not come. They have been hurt enough by people leaving them. Please do not let them down, Zeke." Emmeline read the letter twice more as the children watched her with expressions ranging from hope to resignation. She looked up at their faces, really seeing them for the first time. Johnny, with his protective stance, as he held the baby Clara, with her wary eyes and defensive posture, Samuel bouncing slightly on his feet, as if he couldn't quite contain his energy even in this solemn moment, and the younger ones clustered together like a small pack seeking safety in numbers. "He's not coming back, is he?" Clara asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Emmeline looked at the girl and saw something of herself in those guarded eyes, the look of someone who had been disappointed too, many times to trust easily. "I don't know," she said honestly, "but I'm here now." "You gonna leave too?" Little Hannah asked, the question that was clearly on all their minds. Emmeline's first instinct was to say yes, to find the first stagecoach back to town and put this impossible situation behind her. She had come west to marry a man, not to become an instant mother to 7 children. She had no experience with children, had barely managed to care for herself since Thomas's death. But looking at their faces, seeing the fear and fragile hope in their eyes, she found herself saying, "No, I'm not going to leave." Johnny's eyes narrowed as if he was testing her resolve. "You don't know what you're saying, lady, taking care of all of us. It's not easy, we're not easy." "My name is Emmeline," she said firmly, "and I'm beginning to understand that nothing in life is easy, but that doesn't mean we give up." Pete chose that moment to clear his throat from the doorway. "Begging your pardon, miss, but I should be getting back to town before dark. You want me to take you back with me?" All eyes turned to Emmeline, and she realized that this was the moment that would define not just her future, but the futures of 7 children who had already been abandoned too many times. She thought of the long journey that had brought her here, the hope she had carried in her heart, and the letter in her reticule that had promised a new beginning. Perhaps this wasn't the new beginning she had expected, but it was the one that had been given to her. "No, Pete," she said, her voice stronger than she felt. "I'll be staying. Thank you for bringing me out here." Pete nodded, though he looked uncertain. "If you're sure, miss, there's talk in town about some trouble with Silas Fairweather. Might want to be careful." "Who is Silas Fairweather?" Emmeline asked. "Owns most of the land around these parts." Pete said, "Powerful man, not someone you want to cross paths with if you can help it." After Pete left, Emmeline stood in the front room of the ranch house, looking at the 7 children who were now her responsibility. The magnitude of what she had committed to was beginning to sink in, but there was no turning back now. "Well then," she said, trying to sound more confident than she felt, "I suppose we should start by having supper and getting to know each other properly." "There ain't much food," Samuel said. "We've been trying to make do, but then we'll make do with what we have," Emmeline said, "and tomorrow we'll figure out how to get more. Johnny, can you show me where the kitchen is?" As they moved toward the back of the house, Emmeline caught sight of herself in a mirror that hung on the wall. Her traveling dress was wrinkled and dusty. Her hair was coming loose from its pins, and there was a smudge of dirt on her cheek. She looked like exactly what she was, a woman who had no idea what she was doing, but was determined to try anyway. The kitchen was in better shape than she had expected, with a large stove and a table that could seat all of them. There were dishes in the sink and the remnants of what appeared to be several meals prepared by children who were doing their best to manage on their own. "All right," Emmeline said, rolling up her sleeves. "Let's see what we can put together." As she began to assess the contents of the pantry and icebox, the children gradually relaxed and began to talk. Johnny told her about the daily routines of the ranch. Clara showed her where things were kept, and the younger ones began to chatter about their favorite foods and games. It wasn't until much later, after they had managed to put together a simple meal of beans and cornbread, and the children had been settled for the night, that Emmeline allowed herself to truly absorb what had happened to her in the space of one afternoon. She had gone from being a woman traveling to her wedding to being the sole caregiver for 7 children she had never met. She sat in Zeke's bedroom, holding the letter he had left her and trying to make sense of it. All the room still smelled faintly of his cologne, and his clothes hung in the wardrobe as if he might return at any moment. But the children's stories had painted a picture of a man who had loved them deeply and who would never have left them voluntarily. Something had happened to Ezekiel Mathers, something that had made him disappear without a trace, and now Emmeline was left to pick up the pieces of the life he had built, not just for himself, but for 7 children who had nowhere else to go. She thought of the name Pete had mentioned, Silas Fairweather, and wondered what connection, if any, he might have to Zeke's disappearance. But that was a mystery for another day. Tonight she was just a woman who had promised 7 children that she wouldn't leave them, and who was determined to keep that promise no matter what it cost her. The rooster's crow pierced through Emmeline's exhausted sleep, and she jerked awake in the unfamiliar bed, her heart racing as she tried to remember where she was. The events of the previous day came flooding back: the long journey, the empty ranch house, the 7 children who were now her responsibility, and somewhere in the distance she could hear them stirring. She dressed quickly in one of her simpler dresses and made her way downstairs to find Johnny already in the kitchen, attempting to start a fire in the stove, while Lily fussed in a makeshift cradle nearby. "Morning," she said softly, not wanting to startle him. Johnny looked up from his work, his face flushed with embarrassment. "Couldn't get the fire to catch proper," he said. "Usually Zeke handled the stove in the mornings." Emmeline moved to the stove and examined the setup. "My father taught me a thing or two about stubborn fires," she said, kneeling down to adjust the kindling. "Sometimes they just need a different approach." Within minutes she had coaxed flames to life, and Johnny watched with something that might have been admiration. "You really know how to do that." "I had to learn," Emmeline said simply. "After my parents died, I lived on my own for a while. You learn to manage or you don't eat." Johnny nodded as if this made perfect sense to him. "Zeke always said people who survive are the ones who figure things out instead of giving up." The mention of Zeke sent a pang through Emmeline's chest. "Tell me about him," she said as she began to prepare coffee. "What was he like?" Johnny's expression grew thoughtful. "He was good to us, better than most folks would be taking. In kids that weren't his own blood, he never made us feel like we were burdens, even when we probably were." "How long have you been here?" Emmeline asked. 3 years. Johnny said, "Came here when I was 12, my ma died, and my pa took off, left me. With nothing, Zeke found me trying to steal food from his chicken coop, and instead of turning me over to the sheriff, he offered me a place to stay and work to do." "And the others?" "They all got their own stories," Johnny said. "Clara's been here longest, almost 4 years. Her ma died in childbirth, and her pa couldn't handle raising a girl on his own. Samuel came about 2 years ago. His folks died of fever, and he was living on the streets in town. Bethany and Willie are brother and sister. Their pa got killed in a mining accident, and their ma couldn't feed them. Hannah showed up last winter half froze, to death, been wandering for days after her ma died. And Lily." He glanced toward the baby. Her ma died birthing her and nobody else would take her. Emmeline felt her heart clench as she listened to these stories of loss and abandonment, and Zeke took them all in. Everyone, Johnny said with fierce pride. He said every child deserves a chance to grow up safe and loved. Other children began to drift into the kitchen, drawn by the smell of coffee and the sound of voices. Clara appeared first, still in her nightgown, with her hair hanging loose around her shoulders. She looked younger than her 13 years, and terribly. "Vulnerable morning, Clara," Emmeline said gently. "Did you sleep well?" Clara shrugged and took a seat at the table. "I suppose," she said in a voice that suggested she was still deciding whether to trust this stranger who had appeared in their lives. Samuel bounded in next, already dressed and full of energy. "What's for breakfast?" he asked, looking hopefully at Emmeline. "Whatever we can manage." Emmeline said, "Why don't you help me see what we have to work with?" The next hour was a careful dance of getting to know each other while managing the practical needs of 7 children. Emmeline quickly discovered that each child had their own personality and their own way of dealing with the uncertain situation they found themselves in. Bethany, at 10 years old, had clearly taken on the role of little mother to the younger children. She helped Hannah get dressed and kept Willie from wandering off while Emmeline worked on breakfast. Willie himself seemed to be the most fragile of the group, jumping at sudden noises and staying close to whichever older child was nearest. Hannah was a chatterbox once she warmed up, full of questions and observations about everything around her. "Are you going to be our new ma?" Hannah asked during breakfast, her spoon dripping with oatmeal. Emmeline paused, unsure how to answer. "I'm going to take care of you," she said finally. "We'll figure out the rest as we go." "Zeke said that once," Clara said quietly. "When I first came here, I asked him if he was going to be my new pa, and he said we'd figure it out as we went." "Did you?" Emmeline asked. "Figure it out?" Clara's eyes grew bright with unshed tears. "I thought we had, but then he left just like everybody else always leaves." The pain in the girl's voice was so raw that Emmeline felt it like a physical blow. She set down her coffee cup and reached across the table to touch Clara's hand. "I'm not going anywhere, Clara." "That's what they all say." Clara pulled her hand away and stood up abruptly. "I have chores to do." She left the kitchen with quick steps, and Emmeline was left staring after her. Johnny caught her eye and gave her a look that was both sympathetic and warning. "She's been hurt the most," he said quietly. "Trusted people before and got left behind. Clara, don't give her heart easy anymore." "I can understand that," Emmeline said, and she could. The fear of abandonment was something she knew intimately. After breakfast, Johnny showed her around the ranch, explaining the daily routines and responsibilities. The EIE place was larger than she had initially realized, with several hundred head of cattle grazing in the surrounding pastures, and enough land to support a good-sized operation. "Zeke was building something here," Johnny said as they walked toward the barn. "Said he wanted to leave us all with something solid, something that would last." "What happened to him, Johnny?" Emmeline asked. "Really, what do you think happened?" Johnny was quiet for a long moment, kicking at the dirt with the toe of his boot. "I think somebody didn't want him to succeed," he said finally. "There's been talk around town about folks wanting to buy up the smaller ranches, consolidate the land." "Silas Fairweather," Emmeline said, remembering what Pete had mentioned. Johnny's head snapped up and his eyes narrowed. "What do you know about Fairweather?" "Nothing," Emmeline said quickly. "Pete mentioned his name yesterday, said there might be trouble with him." "Fairweather owns most of the land around here," Johnny said, his voice hard. "He's been trying to buy out the smaller ranches for years, offers them prices that are too good to refuse, and if they don't take his offer, well, sometimes bad things happen to people who cross Silas Fairweather." A chill ran down Emmeline's spine. "You think he had something to do with Zeke's disappearance?" "I don't know," Johnny said, "but I know Zeke was worried about something in the weeks before he disappeared. He kept checking the locks on the doors and he moved his important papers to a hiding place he thought we didn't know about." "What kind of papers?" "Deeds, property documents, things like that." Johnny paused. "And letters, lots of letters." "Letters from whom?" "Don't know," Johnny said, "but some of them had fancy writing on the envelopes like they came from important people in town." They were interrupted by a commotion from the direction of the house, Samuel's voice raised in anger, and the sound of something crashing to the ground. They hurried back to find Samuel facing off with Willie in the kitchen, while the other children watched from the doorway. "Give it back!" Samuel was shouting, his face red with fury. "I didn't take nothing." Willie protested, his voice high and frightened. "You took my marbles." Samuel said, "I know you did." "Samuel," Emmeline said firmly, stepping between the two boys. "What's going on here?" "He took my marbles," Samuel said, pointing at Willie. "They belonged to my brother, and they're the only thing I got left of him." Willie's eyes filled with tears. "I didn't take them, honest, I didn't." Emmeline looked between the two boys and made a quick decision. "Samuel, you look for your marbles in your room and everywhere else you might have left them. Willie, you help Bethany with the dishes, everyone else outside to play. We'll sort this out." Samuel started to protest, but something in Emmeline's expression stopped him. He stomped off toward the stairs, while Willie sniffled and moved to help Bethany as instructed. "You can't just give orders," Clara said from the doorway, her voice challenging. "You don't know anything about us." "You're right," Emmeline said, meeting the girl's hostile gaze. "I don't know anything about you yet, but I'm trying to learn, and in the meantime, we all have to live together peacefully." "For how long?" Clara asked. "Until you get tired of us and leave." The question hung in the air, and Emmeline realized that every child in earshot was waiting for her answer. "I made a promise," she said quietly, "and I keep my promises. Zeke made promises too," Clara said, her voice breaking. "He promised he'd always be here for us." "And maybe he kept that promise," Emmeline said. "Maybe he didn't leave by choice." Clara stared at her for a long moment, then turned and walked away. Emmeline started to follow, but Johnny caught her arm. "Let her go," he said. "Clara needs time to think." The rest of the day passed in a blur of small crises and minor victories. Samuel found his marbles in the barn, where he had apparently been playing with them earlier, and grudgingly apologized to Willie. Willie himself began to open up a little, staying closer to Emmeline and even accepting her help when he struggled with his reading. Hannah continued to chatter and ask questions, while Bethany proved to be a capable helper in managing the household tasks. But Clara remained distant and watchful, speaking only when necessary and disappearing for long stretches of time. Emmeline found her after supper sitting on the front porch, steps looking out at the darkening sky. "Mind if I sit?" Emmeline asked. Clara shrugged, which Emmeline took as permission. She settled herself on the step beside the girl, and for a few minutes they sat in comfortable silence. "Zeke used to sit out here in the evenings," Clara said finally. "Said it helped him think." "What do you think about when you sit out here?" Emmeline asked. "Whether this is all going to fall apart again," Clara said, her voice small. "Whether you're going to decide we're too much trouble and send us away." "Where would I send you?" Emmeline asked. "The orphanage in town," Clara said. "Or split us up, send us to different families if any would take us." "Is that what you think I should do?" Clara was quiet for a long moment. "I think you should do whatever you want," she said finally. "Grown-ups always do anyway." "What I want," Emmeline said carefully, "is to keep you all together and safe. What I want is to figure out what happened to Zeke and make sure whoever is responsible doesn't hurt anyone else. What I want is to build something here that will last." "You sound like him," Clara said softly. "Like Zeke? Maybe that's not such a bad thing." Clara turned to look at her directly for the first time since breakfast. "You really mean it, don't you, about staying?" "I really mean it," Emmeline said, "even if it's hard. Even if we're difficult." Especially then, Emmeline said. Families don't give up on each other when things get difficult. Are we a family? Clara asked the question so quietly that Emmeline almost missed it. We're becoming one. Emmeline said, if you'll let me. Clara didn't answer, but she didn't pull away when Emmeline reached over and took her hand. They sat together on the porch steps as the stars came out, listening to the night sounds of the ranch and the gentle lowing of cattle in the distance. Inside the house, the other children were settling down for the night, and Emmeline knew she should go in soon to make sure everyone was ready for bed. But for now, she was content to sit with Clara and watch the Wyoming sky deepen from purple to black, filled with more stars than she had ever seen in her life. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, she was sure of that. But tonight she had taken the first tentative steps toward becoming the mother these children needed. And perhaps in the process, she was beginning to heal from her own losses as well. The grief over Thomas's death would always be part of her, but it no longer defined her future. She had 7 children to raise, a ranch to run, and a mystery to solve, and somewhere in the distance, she was beginning to hear the sound of hope. 3 days after Emmeline's arrival, a rider approached the ranch house. In the late afternoon sunlight, she was in the kitchen helping Bethany prepare supper when Johnny burst through the door, his face tight. With concern, somebody's coming, he said, moving to the window. Fancy horse, expensive saddle. Emmeline wiped her hands on her apron and joined him at the window. A man in a well-tailored suit sat astride a magnificent black stallion, surveying the ranch with the air of someone who owned everything he looked upon. He was perhaps 50 years old, with greying hair and a moustache that was precisely groomed. Even his posture spoke of wealth and authority. Who is he? Emmeline asked, though she had a sinking feeling she already knew. Silas Fairweather, Johnny said, his voice hard. What's he want here? The other children had gathered around them, drawn by the tension in Johnny's voice. Clara stood with her arms crossed, looking out at the approaching rider with obvious distrust, while the younger ones pressed close to Emmeline, as if seeking protection. Stay inside, Emmeline said firmly. All of you let me handle this. But Johnny started to protest. No, Emmeline said, meeting his eyes. I need to face this man myself. If there's going to be trouble, I don't want any of you caught in the middle of it. She stepped out onto the front porch as Silas Fairweather dismounted from his horse with fluid grace. He was a handsome man. She had to admit, with the kind of presence that commanded attention when he smiled at her. It was warm and charming, but something about it didn't reach his eyes. Miss Turner, I presume, he said, removing his hat and offering a slight bow. I am Silas Fairweather. I own much of the land surrounding this property. Mr. Fairweather, Emmeline said, keeping her voice steady, what brings you to our ranch? Our ranch, he repeated, his smile widening. I like that it shows you've already developed an attachment to the place. That's good, very good indeed. Is there something I can help you with? Emmeline asked, not liking the way he was looking at her as if she were a piece of property he was considering purchasing. I came to offer my condolences on Ezekiel's disappearance. Fairweather said, his voice taking on a sympathetic tone. Such a tragedy when a good man simply vanishes without a trace. You sound as if you believe he's dead, Emmeline said, watching his face carefully. Well now, I certainly hope that's not the case, Fairweather said, though his tone suggested otherwise. But when a man disappears in this territory, especially a man who's been having financial difficulties, well, one has to consider all possibilities. Financial difficulties? Emmeline repeated. What financial difficulties? Fairweather's eyebrows rose in apparent surprise. Surely you know about Ezekiel's debts, the mortgages on this property, the loans he took out to expand his operation. Emmeline's mind Raced, she had found no evidence of any financial problems when she had examined Zeke's papers. In fact, the ranch seemed to be doing quite well. I'm not aware of any debts. Oh, my dear woman, Fairweather said, shaking his head sadly, I'm afraid Ezekiel wasn't entirely honest with you about his circumstances. This property is mortgaged to the hilt, and the payments are already 3 months behind. That's impossible, Emmeline said, though doubt was beginning to creep into her voice. The ranch is profitable, the cattle are healthy, the land is productive. On the surface, perhaps, Fairweather said, but appearances can be deceiving. Ezekiel was a proud man, too proud to admit when he was in over his head. Even if that were true, Emmeline said, what business is it of yours? Ah, well, that's where I might be able to help, Fairweather said, his smile returning. You see, I hold several of those mortgages, and I'm prepared to be quite generous in my terms. Generous how? I'm prepared to offer you a way out of this mess, Fairweather said, stepping closer. I'll purchase the property from you at a fair price, enough to cover the debts and leave you with a tidy sum to start fresh somewhere else. And the children? Emmeline asked. The children? Fairweather's expression grew thoughtful. Well, that is a complication, isn't it? 7 mouths to feed, 7 futures to secure. That's a heavy burden for a young woman to bear alone. They're not a burden, Emmeline said, her voice sharp. They're family. Of course, Fairweather said quickly. But you must be practical, my dear. What can you offer them here? A struggling ranch, mounting debts, an uncertain future, whereas if you accept my offer, you could take them somewhere. Safe somewhere with better opportunities. Such as, there's a fine orphanage in Denver. Fairweather said, well-funded, excellent facilities. The children would receive proper education training for useful trades. You want me to put them in an orphanage? Emmeline's voice was deadly quiet. I want you to consider what's best for them. Fairweather said, sentiment is all well and good, but these children need stability, security. They need family. Emmeline said, they need love. Love doesn't put food on the table. Fairweather said, his voice hardening slightly. Love doesn't pay mortgages or buy winter clothes. And you're certain these debts exist? Emmeline asked. I have all the documentation, Fairweather said, patting his coat pocket. I brought copies for you to review. Of course, you'll want to verify everything with the bank in town. He handed her a thick envelope sealed with wax. Emmeline took it reluctantly, knowing that once she opened it, her world might change forever. I don't need to review anything, she said, handing the envelope back. I'm not selling. Fairweather's genial expression slipped for just a moment, revealing something cold and calculating underneath. My dear Miss Turner, I don't think you understand the seriousness of your situation. I understand perfectly, Emmeline said, standing straighter. You're trying to pressure me into selling land that isn't yours to claim. The land will be mine soon enough, Fairweather said, when the mortgages are foreclosed and the property goes to auction. I'm simply offering you a chance to walk away with something rather than nothing. And if I refuse, Fairweather's smile was thin and predatory, then you'll discover just how difficult life can be. For a woman trying to run a ranch on her own in this territory, there are so many things that can go wrong. Cattle can stray, fences can be cut, accidents can happen. The threat was clear, and Emmeline felt a chill run down her spine. But she refused to let her fear show. Is that what happened to Zeke, an accident? Ezekiel was a stubborn man. Fairweather said he refused to see reason, refused to accept help when it was offered. Sometimes stubbornness can be dangerous. Are you threatening? And Mr. Fairweather, threatening? Fairweather laughed. My dear woman, I'm trying to help you. Surely you can see that. What I see, Emmeline said, is a man who wants something that doesn't belong to him. Fairweather's expression grew cold. Everything in this valley belongs to me. Eventually, Miss Turner, one way or another, it all comes to me in the end. Ezekiel learned that lesson, though perhaps too late. Get off my property, Emmeline said, her voice shaking with anger. "Your property." "Fairweather," said, mounting his horse. "We'll see about that. I'll give you 1 week to reconsider my offer. After that, things might become unpleasant." He rode away without looking back, leaving Emmeline standing on the porch with her heart racing and her hands trembling. She had made an enemy, and she knew it, but she had also learned something important. Silas Fairweather was definitely involved in Zeke's disappearance, and he was determined to get his hands on their ranch. Johnny appeared at her side so quietly she didn't notice him until he spoke. "Heard every word," he said, his young face hard with anger. "He's the one, ain't he, the one who hurt Zeke?" "I think so," Emmeline said, "but we'll need proof." "I'll find proof," Johnny said. Fiercely, "I'll find out what he did." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "We'll find out," Emmeline corrected, "together." "You're really going to fight him?" Johnny asked. "Even though he's got money and power and we're family," Emmeline said firmly, "and families protect each other." Johnny stared at her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Yeah," he said, "we are family, aren't we?" That evening, after the children had been put to bed, Emmeline sat at Zeke's desk in his study, examining the papers she had found in his strongbox. The financial records told a different story than the one Silas Fairweather had painted. The ranch was not only profitable, but expanding. Zeke had been making improvements, adding cattle, and even considering purchasing additional land. There were no mortgages, no debts beyond the normal operating expenses of a working ranch. But there was something else among the papers that made her blood run cold. A series of letters from various businessmen in town, all expressing interest in purchasing the ranch, all offering prices that seemed far too low for the property's actual value, and all mentioning Silas Fairweather as a potential buyer. The pattern was clear. Fairweather had been orchestrating a campaign to pressure Zeke into selling, using his influence with other businessmen to make life difficult for anyone who refused his offers. But Zeke had been stubborn, as Fairweather himself had said, and that stubbornness might have cost him his life. A soft knock at the study door interrupted her thoughts. "Come in," she called. Clara entered carrying a cup of tea. "Thought you might need this," she said, setting it down on the desk. "Thank you," Emmeline said, surprised by the gesture. "That's very thoughtful." Clara lingered by the desk, looking at the papers scattered across its surface. "Those are Zeke's business things," she said. "Yes." Emmeline said, "I'm trying to understand what happened to him." "Johnny told us about the man who came today," Clara said, "about what he wanted." "Mr. Fairweather seems to think he can frighten me into selling." Emmeline said, "He's wrong. He frightened Zeke," Clara said quietly. "Near the end, Zeke was scared, I could tell, even though he tried to hide it." "What did you see, Clara? What made you think he was frightened?" Clara sat down in the chair across from the desk. "He started locking doors that he never used to lock. He moved his important papers from the bank to here, and he made us promise that if anything ever happened to him, we'd stick together no matter what." "Did he say what he thought might happen?" "No, but he wrote you that letter, the one Johnny gave you. He wrote it the night before he disappeared. I saw him working on it late when I got up to check on Lily." Emmeline leaned forward. "Clara, this is important. Did you see anyone else around the ranch in the days before Zeke disappeared? Any strangers? Anyone who didn't belong?" Clara nodded slowly. "There was a man couple days before, a rough-looking fellow, said he worked for Mr. Fairweather. He came to the door asking about buying cattle, but Zeke wouldn't even talk to him, told him to get off the property." "Did you hear what the man said?" "Some of it," Clara said. "He told Zeke that Mr. Fairweather was being patient, but his patience wasn't going to last forever, and that there were other ways to settle things if Zeke wouldn't be reasonable." Emmeline felt her heart sink. This was as close to proof as she was likely to get that Fairweather was behind Zeke's disappearance, but it wasn't the kind of proof that would stand up in a court of law, especially not when Fairweather seemed to have so much influence in town. "Clara," she said carefully, "what do you think happened to Zeke?" The girl was quiet, for a long moment staring down at her hands. "I think Mr. Fairweather had him killed," she said finally, "and I think he's going to try to kill you too if you don't give him what he wants." The blunt assessment sent a chill through Emmeline, but she forced herself to remain calm. "Then we'll have to make sure he doesn't succeed, won't we?" "How?" Clara asked. "He's got money and men who work for him. We're just kids and a woman who doesn't know anything about ranching." "We learn," Emmeline said. Firmly, "We get help from people in town who aren't under Fairweather's influence, and we prove what he did to Zeke." "What if there aren't any people like that? What if he owns the whole town?" "Then we fight him anyway," Emmeline said, "because the alternative is letting him win, letting him take everything Zeke built and scatter all of you to the winds." Clara looked at her with something that might have been admiration. "You're different than I thought you'd be," she said, stronger. "I'm learning to be strong," Emmeline said. "You children are teaching me." "We are. Every day," Emmeline said, "watching you take care of each other, seeing how brave you all are in the face of uncertainty, it makes me want to be worthy of your trust." Clara smiled for the first time since Emmeline had arrived, a real smile that transformed her entire face. "Zeke used to say we made him stronger too." "Smart man," Emmeline said. "I wish I could have met him." "Maybe you still will," Clara said. "Maybe. He's not really dead. Maybe he's just hiding somewhere waiting for it to be safe to come back." Emmeline didn't have the heart to crush that hope, even though she was becoming increasingly certain that Zeke Mathers was never coming home. "Maybe," she said, "but either way we have work to do." Over the next few days, Emmeline threw herself into learning everything she could about running the ranch. Johnny proved to be an excellent teacher, showing her how to check the cattle for signs of illness, how to mend fences, and how to manage the books that track the ranch's income and expenses. The other children pitched in as well, each contributing according to their abilities. Samuel turned out to have a gift for handling the horses, while Bethany was surprisingly good at managing the household budget. Clara proved to be an excellent cook when given the chance, and even little Hannah helped by gathering eggs and feeding the chickens. Willie remained shy and nervous, but he was eager to please, and tried his best at whatever task he was given. Lily, the baby, was perhaps the greatest challenge, requiring constant attention and care. But Emmeline found herself growing attached to the little girl's bright eyes and ready smile. There was something healing about caring for someone so innocent and trusting, but even as they settled into their routines, Emmeline remained acutely aware that they were living on borrowed time. Fairweather's deadline was approaching, and she had no illusions about what would happen when it passed. The man was ruthless and determined, and he had already proven that he was willing to resort to violence to get what he wanted. She needed allies, but her first trip into town proved discouraging. Most of the businesses were either owned by Fairweather or dependent on his patronage for their survival. The few people who were willing to talk to her spoke in hushed voices and glanced nervously over their shoulders, as if afraid of being overheard. It was the bank manager, Mr. Henderson, who finally confirmed what she had begun to suspect. "Miss Turner," he said when she asked about Zeke's accounts, "I'm afraid I can't discuss Mr. Mathers's financial affairs with you. You're not legally authorized to access his accounts." "But surely, as his intended bride, without a marriage certificate or power of attorney," Henderson said uncomfortably, "my hands are tied." "Then perhaps you can tell me about these mortgage documents," Emmeline said, producing the papers. Fairweather had tried to give her. Henderson examined them carefully, his face growing more and more troubled. "Miss Turner," he said finally, "these documents are forgeries. This bank never issued any mortgages on the Mathers property." "Forgeries." Emmeline's heart leaped. "You're certain?" "Absolutely." Henderson said, "The signatures are wrong, the paper is wrong, even the bank seal is incorrect. Whoever created these did a sloppy job." "Would you be willing to testify to that?" Henderson's face went pale. "Miss Turner, I have a family to think of, and Mr. Fairweather, he's not a man you cross lightly, so you'll let him get away with fraud, with murder." "I'm not saying he's guilty of anything," Henderson said quickly. "I'm just saying these particular documents didn't come from this bank." It was something, but not enough. Emmeline left the bank feeling frustrated and more isolated than ever. She was beginning to understand why Zeke had been frightened. Fairweather's influence extended throughout the town like a spider's web, touching everyone and everything. As she walked down the main street, she noticed how people looked at her, some with curiosity, others with what might have been pity. But no one approached her. No one offered help or even friendly conversation. She was marked now as Fairweather's enemy, and that made her dangerous to know. She was so lost in her thoughts that she almost missed the woman who stepped out of the general store just ahead of her, a woman with graying hair and kind eyes who looked at Emmeline with recognition and something that might have been sympathy. "You're Miss Turner," the woman said. "Zeke's intended." "Yes," Emmeline said cautiously. "I'm Margaret Taylor, but folks call me Maggie. I run the dress shop down the street." The woman extended her hand. "I knew Zeke well, good man, terrible. What happened to him?" "Mrs. Taylor," Emmeline said, taking her hand. Gratefully, "It's good to meet someone who knew him." "Walk with me," Maggie said, glancing around nervously. "We shouldn't talk here, too many ears." They walked together toward the edge of town, Maggie keeping up a stream of inconsequential chatter about the weather and business until they were well away from any potential listeners. "Now then," Maggie said, when they reached a small grove of trees, "we can speak freely here." "Mrs. Taylor." "Maggie, please. And I know what you're thinking. Why should you trust me? Well, the truth is, you probably shouldn't trust anyone in this town. But I'll tell you this much. I cared about Zeke Mathers, and I care about those children, and I don't like what Silas Fairweather is doing to decent folks." "Then you know what he's been doing?" "I know he's been buying up property for years, always at prices well below market value, and I know that folks who refuse his offers tend to have bad luck." Maggie's expression was grim. "Cattle die fences, get cut accidents happen. And the sheriff, Fairweather's man through and through, been in his pocket for years. Then there's no legal recourse, no way to prove what he's done. Not through official channels," Maggie said, "but there might be another way." "What do you mean?" Maggie looked around once more to make sure they weren't being observed. "There's a man named of Rufus Gray, works for Fairweather, has for years, but lately he's been having second thoughts about some of the things he's been asked to do." "You think he might help us?" "I think he might, if he was approached the right way. Rufus has a conscience buried under all that loyalty and fear, but it's still there." "Where would I find him?" "He drinks at Murphy's saloon most evenings, sits alone in the back corner, doesn't talk much, but he listens." Maggie paused. "Be careful, though. If Fairweather finds out you've been talking to his men, things could get worse for you and those children." "They're already bad," Emmeline said, "and they're going to get worse whether I do anything or not. At least this way I have a chance to fight back." Maggie nodded approvingly. "Zeke would have liked your backbone," she said. "He was a fighter too, right up until the end." As they parted ways, Emmeline felt the first stirring of real hope. Since her arrival in Wyoming, she wasn't completely alone. There were people in town who knew what Fairweather was doing, even if they were too frightened to speak out openly, and if she could somehow reach Rufus Gray, convince him to help her, Then maybe she could find the proof she needed to bring Fairweather down. But as she rode back to the ranch, she couldn't shake the feeling that time was running out. Fairweather's deadline was only 3 days away, and she doubted he would be patient much longer. The man wanted the ranch, and he was accustomed to getting what he wanted. That night, as she tucked the children into bed, she looked at each of their faces and made a silent promise she would find a way to protect them no matter what it cost her. They had already lost too much, already been abandoned by too many people who should have cared for them. She would not let them down. Tomorrow she would go to Murphy's saloon and try to convince a man she had never met to betray his employer for the sake of justice. It was a long shot, but it was the only shot she had, and sometimes Emmeline was beginning to learn long shots were the only ones worth taking. The following evening, Emmeline made her way into town as the sun set behind the mountains, casting long shadows across the dusty main street. She had left the children in Johnny's capable hands, with strict instructions to keep the doors locked and to hide if anyone approached. The ranch, her heart hammered as she tied her horse outside Murphy's saloon, an establishment she would never have entered under normal circumstances. But these were far from normal circumstances. The saloon was dimly lit and thick with tobacco smoke. When she pushed through the batwing doors, conversations died and heads turned as every man in the place stared at her. A woman alone in a saloon was unusual enough to draw attention, but Emmeline forced herself to walk steadily toward the bar, keeping her chin up and her expression calm. "Ma'am," the bartender said, his voice carefully neutral, "this ain't really the place for a lady." "I'm looking for Rufus Gray," Emmeline said quietly. "Maggie Taylor said I might find him here." The bartender's eyes flicked toward the back corner of the room where a solitary figure sat hunched over a whiskey glass. "That'd be him," he said. "But I'd be careful if I were you. Rufus ain't much for conversation, especially with strangers." Emmeline nodded and made her way through the maze of tables, ignoring the stares and whispered comments that followed her wake. Rufus Gray was exactly as Maggie had described him, a weathered man in his 40s, with graying hair and the kind of face that had seen too much of the world's cruelty. He looked up as she approached, his eyes wary and suspicious. "Mr. Gray," she said, "I'm Emmeline Turner. I wonder if I might have a word with you." Rufus studied her for a long moment, then gestured to the empty chair across from him. "Sit if you want," he said, his voice gravelly from years of whiskey and hard living, "but I ain't got much to say to folks these days." Emmeline sat down and folded her hands on the table. "Maggie Taylor suggested you might be willing to help me." "Maggie talks too much," Rufus said, taking a long drink from his glass, "and she's got a romantic notion about right and wrong that ain't practical in the real world. The real world where men like Silas Fairweather can make people disappear without consequences." Emmeline said. Rufus's hand tightened around his glass, and his eyes grew hard. "You best be careful what you say in public. Miss Turner walls have ears in this town." "Then perhaps we should go somewhere more private." Rufus was quiet for a long moment, studying her face as if trying to read her intentions. "Why would you think I'd help you?" he said finally. "I work for Mr. Fairweather, have for near 10 years. "Because Maggie thinks you have a conscience," Emmeline said, "and because I think you know what happened to Ezekiel Mathers." Something flickered in Rufus's eyes, pain or regret, or perhaps just weariness. "Ezekiel Mathers was a fool," he said, "thought he could stand up to forces bigger than himself." "And you think that makes his death justified?" "I think it makes it inevitable," Rufus said, but there was no conviction in his voice. "Some fights you can't win, Miss Turner, and the smart thing is to recognize that before you get yourself killed. The children I'm caring for don't have the luxury of walking away from this fight," Emmeline said. "Neither do I." Rufus finished his whiskey and signaled the bartender for another. "Those kids," he said, "they really mean something to you." "They're my family now," Emmeline said simply. "Family." Rufus repeated the word as if it were foreign to him. ain't had much of that in my life. It's not too late." Rufus laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Lady, you don't know what you're asking. I got debts to Mr. Fairweather, debts that can't be paid with money, if you understand my meaning." "What kind of debts?" Rufus looked around the saloon, then leaned forward, lowering his voice. "The kind that come from doing things you can't undo, the kind that mean if you cross the man who owns you, he don't just fire you, he makes sure you never work anywhere again or worse." "You're talking about what happened to Zeke." "I ain't talking about nothing," Rufus said quickly, "and neither are you, if you're smart." But Emmeline could see the conflict in his eyes, the war between fear and conscience that was tearing him apart. "Rufus," she said, using his first name deliberately, "how many more good men have to die before someone finds the courage to say enough? You think I ain't got courage?" Rufus's voice was sharp. "Lady, I got more courage than you know. Just sitting here talking to you is about the bravest thing I done in years." "Then help me," Emmeline said, leaning forward. "Help me prove. What Fairweather did help me protect those children." Rufus stared into his whiskey glass for a long time when he finally looked up. His eyes were haunted. "Even if I wanted to help, and I ain't saying I do, what makes you think I got any proof of anything?" "Because men like Fairweather don't do their own dirty work," Emmeline said. "They use men like you, and when they do, they leave trails. Trails that can get a man killed for following them, or trails that can finally bring a killer to justice." Rufus was quiet again, wrestling with demons Emmeline could only imagine. "There's a place," he said finally, so quietly she had to strain to hear him. "Old line shack about 5 miles north of your ranch if you was to ride out there tomorrow. Night around midnight, and if someone was to meet you there, well, that someone might have things to say." "What things?" "Things about where certain people might have gone and who might have sent them there." Rufus finished his drink and stood up. "But if anyone asks, you never talk to me, and you sure as hell never heard about any line shack." He left without another word, walking out of the saloon with the measured steps of a man who had just made a decision that could cost him his life. Emmeline sat alone at the table for a few more minutes, trying to process what had just happened. Then she too rose and made her way out of the saloon, aware of the eyes that followed her every move. The ride back to the ranch gave her time to think about what Rufus had offered and what it might cost, not just him, but all of them. If Fairweather discovered their meeting, she was putting the children at risk, but she was also potentially saving them. If Rufus had real evidence of Fairweather's crimes, it could be enough to bring the man down. When she arrived home, she found Johnny waiting up for her in the kitchen, his young face creased with worry. "Everything all right?" he asked. "I think so." Emmeline said, "I may have found someone willing to help us. Someone we can trust. Someone who wants to do the right thing," Emmeline said. "Whether we can trust him remains to be seen." The next day passed slowly. Emmeline tried to maintain normal routines for the children's sake, but her mind kept returning to the planned meeting at the line shack. What would Rufus tell her? And more importantly, what would she do with the information? If it proved what she suspected, Clara seemed to sense her distraction. "You're worried about something," the girl said as they worked together preparing supper. "I'm always worried about something these days," Emmeline said, trying to keep her tone light. "This is different," Clara said. "You look like Zeke used to look in those last weeks before he disappeared." Emmeline set down the knife she'd been using to cut vegetables and turned to face Clara. "I'm going to meet someone tonight, someone who might have information about what happened to Zeke. It's dangerous, isn't it?" "Probably," Emmeline said, "but so is doing nothing." Clara nodded slowly. "I want to come with you." "Absolutely not." "You said we're family." Clara said, "Families stick together, especially when there's danger." "Families also protect each other," Emmeline said, "and I'm protecting you by going alone. What if something happens to you? What if you don't come back?" The fear in Clara's voice was raw, and Emmeline felt her heart clench. "I'll come back," she said. "I promise. Zeke probably thought he'd come back too." It was a sobering thought, and one that stayed with Emmeline as the evening wore on. She made arrangements with Johnny to care for the younger children if she didn't return by morning, though she tried to frame it as a precaution rather than a real possibility. As midnight approached, she saddled her horse and prepared to ride out to the line shack. The night was clear and cold, with a full moon that cast everything in silver light. She had brought Zeke's pistol, though she hoped she wouldn't need to use it. The line shack was exactly where Rufus had said it would be, a small weathered building that had once housed cowboys during roundup, but now stood empty and forgotten. Emmeline dismounted and tied her horse to a post, then settled down to wait. She didn't have to wait long. Within minutes, she heard the sound of approaching hoofbeats, and Rufus Gray emerged from the shadows, leading his horse on foot rather than riding. "Thought you might not come," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I keep my word," Emmeline said. "Do you?" Instead of answering, Rufus reached into his saddlebags and pulled out a cloth-wrapped bundle. "This here's everything I got," he said. "Letters, documents, things that probably shouldn't exist but do." Emmeline took the bundle with trembling hands. "What am I going to find?" "Proof," Rufus said simply. "Proof that Silas Fairweather has been systematically driving folks off their land for years. Proof that he's used violence and intimidation, and worse, to get what he wants." And Zeke, Rufus's face was grim in the moonlight. Zeke found out about some of Fairweather's dealings, tried to organize the other small ranchers to stand up to him. Fairweather couldn't let that happen. So he had him killed. "I can't prove that," Rufus said, "but I can prove he ordered it, and I can prove where the body is buried." Emmeline felt the world spin around her. "You know where Zeke is. 1.5 miles east of here, there's a old mine shaft, been closed for years. That's where they put him." Rufus's voice was thick with self-loathing. "I helped dig the grave." The admission hung in the air between them, heavy with guilt and sorrow. Emmeline stared at the man who had just confessed to being accessory to murder, trying to reconcile his obvious remorse with the enormity of what he had done. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked. "Why are you giving me this evidence?" "Because I'm tired," Rufus said. "Tired of being afraid, tired of doing things that make me hate myself, tired of watching good people suffer while evil men prosper. If I use this evidence, you'll hang alongside Fairweather." "Maybe," Rufus said, "but at least I'll hang for doing the right thing for once in my life." He mounted his horse and looked down at her. "Be careful, Miss Turner, once you open that bundle. There's no going back. Fairweather will know someone betrayed him, and he'll come after you with everything he's got." "Let him come," Emmeline said, clutching the bundle to her chest. "I'm not afraid anymore." Rufus smiled sadly. "No," he said, "I don't." "Reckon you are." Then he rode away, disappearing into the night as quietly as he had come. Emmeline stood alone beside the line shack, holding the evidence that could finally bring justice for Zeke and protection for her children. But as she mounted her horse to ride home, she couldn't shake Rufus's warning. Once she opened that bundle, there would be no going back. Emmeline waited until the children were asleep before examining the contents of Rufus's bundle in the privacy of Zeke's study. She spread the documents across the desk by lamplight, her hands trembling as she read through correspondence that painted a picture of systematic corruption and violence that went back years. The letters were damning, Fairweather's own handwriting, detailing payments to men for handling problems and persuading reluctant sellers. There were receipts for services that were clearly euphemisms for violence and intimidation, and most chilling of all, a letter dated just days before Zeke's disappearance that simply read, "The Mathers situation must be resolved permanently." But it was the map tucked at the bottom of the bundle that made Emmeline's blood run cold. A hand-drawn diagram showing the location of the old mine shaft where Rufus claimed Zeke's body had been hidden, marked with an X and the notation EM Final Resting Place. written in Fairweather's distinctive script. She sat back in Zeke's chair, trying to absorb the full implications of what she held. The evidence was overwhelming. Enough to convict Fairweather of multiple crimes, including murder. But it was also a death sentence for anyone who tried to use it against him. The man had too much power, too many connections to go down quietly. A soft knock at the study door interrupted her thoughts, and Johnny entered carrying a cup of coffee, his face grave. "Figured you might need this," he said, setting the cup down and glancing at the papers spread across the desk. "Johnny, you shouldn't be up." "Couldn't sleep," he said. "Kept thinking about where you went tonight and what you might find." He paused, studying her expression. "Looks like you found something." Emmeline hesitated, then made a decision. Johnny was 15, old enough to understand the gravity of their situation and mature enough to help her plan their next move. "Sit down," she said. "There are things you need to know." She told him everything: Rufus's confession, the evidence in the bundle, the location of Zeke's grave. Johnny listened in silence, his young face growing harder with each revelation. When she finished, he was quiet for a long time. "So Fairweather really did kill him," he said finally. "Yes," Emmeline said. "And if we try to expose him, he'll probably try to kill us too. So what do we do?" It was the question Emmeline had been wrestling with since leaving the line shack. The evidence was powerful but useless without someone willing to act on it. The local sheriff was in Fairweather's pocket, and the nearest federal marshal was hundreds of miles away. Even if she could get word to outside authorities, Fairweather would have plenty of time to cover his tracks and eliminate any threats. "We could run," she said, thinking aloud. "Take the children and leave Wyoming, start over somewhere else." "With what money?" Johnny asked, practically. "And what's to stop Fairweather from tracking us down? He's got resources, connections. We'd be looking over our shoulders for the rest of our lives." "Then we fight," Emmeline said. "We find a way to use this evidence against him." "How?" Emmeline stared at the papers scattered across the desk, an idea beginning to form in her mind. Dangerous and desperate, but perhaps their only chance. "We make him come to us," she said. "We force his hand." "What do you mean?" "Tomorrow is his deadline," Emmeline said. "He's expecting me to either accept his offer or face the consequences. What if instead I told him I had evidence of his crimes? What if I threatened to expose him?" Johnny's eyes widened. "You want to blackmail Silas Fairweather. I want to draw him out, make him reveal himself in front of witnesses," Emmeline said, her plan crystallizing as she spoke. "If we can get him to admit what he's done in front of people who can't be bought." "Who?" Johnny asked. "Everyone in town is either afraid of him or works for him." "Not everyone," Emmeline said, thinking of Maggie Taylor and her quiet defiance. "There are good people in this town. People who want to do the right thing. They just need someone to show them it's possible." They spent the rest of the night planning their strategy. It was risky, bordering on suicidal, but it was also the only path forward that didn't involve abandoning everything Zeke had built and everything the children needed. The next morning, Emmeline sent Johnny into town with a message for Silas Fairweather, a simple note requesting a meeting that afternoon at the ranch to discuss his offer. The boy returned within an hour, with Fairweather's reply he would be there at 2 o'clock. Emmeline spent the remaining time preparing both practically and emotionally. She cleaned Zeke's pistol and made sure it was loaded, then hid it in the desk drawer within easy reach. She also wrote letters to be sent to federal authorities in case something happened to her. Detailed accounts of Fairweather's crimes, supported by copies of the evidence Rufus had provided. "Are you scared?" Clara asked, as they waited for Fairweather to arrive. "Terrified," Emmeline admitted. "But sometimes being scared is what tells you you're doing something important." Fairweather arrived precisely at 2 o'clock, accompanied by 2 men who looked like hired gunfighters. Emmeline met them on the front porch, keeping her expression calm despite the fear that clawed at her insides. "Miss Turner," Fairweather said, dismounting from his horse with fluid grace, "I trust you've had time to consider my generous offer." "I have," Emmeline said, "and I've decided to make you an offer of my own." Fairweather's eyebrows rose in apparent amusement. "Indeed, and what might that be?" "I'll sell you the ranch for exactly what it's worth," Emmeline said. "Fair market value, not the pittance you've been offering." "My dear woman, I'm afraid you're not in a position to negotiate, Fairweather," said his tone condescending. "Your circumstances haven't improved since our last conversation." "Haven't they?" Emmeline reached into her apron pocket and pulled out one of the letters from Rufus's bundle. "This is interesting reading, Mr. Fairweather. Your handwriting, I believe." Fairweather's expression didn't change, but she saw his eyes sharpen as he read the letter's contents. "Where did you get this?" "Does it matter?" Emmeline said. "What matters is what it says, and what a federal marshal might think of it." "You're bluffing," Fairweather said, but his voice had lost some of its confidence. "That document proves nothing." "This one doesn't," Emmeline agreed. "But I have others, much more detailed correspondence about your business practices, including some very specific instructions regarding the permanent resolution of problems." She watched as understanding dawned in Fairweather's eyes, followed quickly by rage. "You have no idea what you're playing with," he said, his veneer of civility finally cracking. "You're a foolish woman who's about to make a fatal mistake." "The only fatal mistake was yours," Emmeline said, "when you murdered Ezekiel Mathers." "Murdered?" Fairweather laughed, but it was a cold sound devoid of humour. "Such a dramatic word. My dear Ezekiel had an accident, a tragic fall from his horse into a mine shaft," Emmeline said. "Quite a distance to fall by accident." Fairweather's face went white, then red with fury. "You know nothing," he snarled, "nothing that can be proven." "I know where his body is buried," Emmeline said. "I know who helped put him there, and I know you ordered it done." "Even if that were true," Fairweather said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper, "what makes you think you'll live long enough to tell anyone?" It was the admission Emmeline had been hoping for, but before she could respond, one of Fairweather's men stepped forward, his hand moving to his gun. "Boss," the man said, "we got company." Emmeline looked past them to see riders approaching from town, a small group led by Maggie Taylor, and including several other townspeople. She had not expected this development, but she realized that Maggie must have been watching and waiting for the confrontation. "Silas," Maggie called out as the group drew near, "what brings you out to the Turner place?" "Private business, Maggie," Fairweather said, his composure returning. "Nothing that concerns you." "Oh, but it does concern me," Maggie said, dismounting from her horse. "You see, Miss Turner here asked me to witness your meeting, wanted to make sure there were no misunderstandings about what was said." Fairweather's eyes flicked between Emmeline and Maggie, calculating the new situation. "I see," he said. "And what exactly did Miss Turner ask you to witness?" "Whatever you might have to say about your business dealings," Maggie said pleasantly, "particularly anything regarding Ezekiel Mathers." "I'm afraid there's been a misunderstanding," Fairweather said, his smile returning but strained around the edges. "Miss Turner seems to have gotten some strange ideas about Mr. Mathers's disappearance." "Strange ideas? Like the fact that you had him killed?" Emmeline said, loudly enough for everyone to hear. A murmur went through the gathered townspeople, and Fairweather's face darkened. "That's a serious accusation, Miss Turner, one you can't possibly prove." "Can't I?" Emmeline held up the bundle of documents. "Perhaps these good people would like to hear some of your correspondence, Mr. Fairweather, your very detailed instructions about handling problems." Fairweather's hand moved toward his coat, and Emmeline tensed, but instead of drawing a weapon, he pulled out a folded paper. "I think you'll find this more interesting," he said, "a legal document transferring ownership of this property to me, signed by Ezekiel Mathers himself." "Another forgery," Emmeline said, but doubt crept into her voice. Witnessed and notarized. Fairweather said smoothly, perfectly legal. The day before he disappeared, Emmeline said, understanding flooding through her. You forced him to sign it. I convinced him it was in his best interests, Fairweather said, and in the best interests of those children he was so fond of. The confession was subtle but clear enough for the witnesses to understand. Emmeline saw recognition dawning in several faces and knew that finally the truth was coming to light. So you admit you coerced him, she said. I admit nothing, Fairweather said, but his confident facade was cracking. And even if I did, what proof do you have that any crime was committed? Ezekiel Mathers signed over his property and then had an unfortunate accident. An accident you arranged. Emmeline said. Fairweather's mask finally slipped completely. The man was a fool, he snarled. Thought he could organize the other ranchers against me? Thought he could protect what was never his to begin with? Everything in this valley belongs to me eventually, and I'll do whatever it takes to claim what's mine. The words hung in the air, witnessed by a dozen people who could no longer deny what they had suspected for years. Silas Fairweather was a murderer and a thief who had used fear and violence to build his empire. But even as Emmeline felt a surge of triumph, she knew the real battle was just beginning. Fairweather still had power, still had men willing to do his bidding, and cornered animals were always the most dangerous. Well then, Maggie said into the silence, I think we've heard enough. Fairweather looked around at the faces surrounding him, reading the condemnation in their eyes. His hand moved again toward his coat, but this time Johnny stepped out from behind the house, carrying Zeke's rifle pointed directly at the man who had killed his guardian. I wouldn't, the boy said, his voice steady despite his youth. Not unless you want to join Zeke wherever you sent him. The standoff stretched for long moments, with Fairweather caught between Johnny's rifle and the circle of witnesses who had heard his confession. The hired gunman shifted nervously, clearly uncomfortable with the changed dynamics, but unwilling to draw on a group that included townspeople they might have to face later. You've made a grave mistake, boy, Fairweather said to Johnny, though his voice lacked its usual authority, threatening a man like me. The only mistake was not doing this sooner, Johnny replied, his rifle never wavering for Zeke. Emmeline stepped forward, carefully keeping her hands visible. Mr. Fairweather, your own words have condemned you. These people have heard you admit to coercing Zeke and arranging his death. Hearsay, Fairweather said, but sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cool afternoon air. The word of a vindictive woman and a bunch of townspeople with their own grudges. Perhaps, Maggie Taylor said, but when combined with whatever evidence Miss Turner has gathered, it should make for interesting reading by federal authorities. Fairweather's eyes darted between the faces surrounding him, calculating odds and finding them unfavorable. You think you've won, he said finally, but this isn't over, not by a long shot. It is for today. Emmeline said, I suggest you leave my property before we decide to escort you to the sheriff. Your property? Fairweather laughed harshly. I have legal documents. Forged documents, Emmeline said, just like the mortgage papers you showed me, and I'm sure any handwriting expert would confirm that. Fairweather stared at her for a long moment, then slowly mounted his horse, his men following suit with obvious relief. This isn't finished, Miss Turner, he said. I don't lose gracefully. Then perhaps it's time you learned, Emmeline replied. As Fairweather and his men rode away, the tension began to drain from the gathering, leaving behind a mixture of relief and apprehension. The townspeople looked at each other as if seeing their neighbors clearly for the first time in years. Well, Maggie said, breaking the silence, that was certainly educational. It was just the beginning. Emmeline said, he'll be back, and next time he won't come to talk. Then we'd better be ready, said a voice from the crowd. It was Henry Morrison, the blacksmith, A man Emmeline had barely spoken to. "Can't say I approve of what I heard today." Other voices murmured agreement, and Emmeline felt a surge of hope. These people had found their courage at last. But she also knew how fragile such courage could be when faced with real consequences. "Thank you," she said to the group. "All of you for coming, for witnessing what happened here. We should have done it years ago," Maggie said quietly. "Should have stood up to him before it cost good men their lives." After the townspeople departed, Emmeline gathered the children in the main room of the house to explain what had happened. She kept the details appropriate for their ages, but made sure they understood that the danger wasn't over. So, Mr. Fairweather really did hurt Zeke. Little Hannah set her eyes wide. "Yes, sweetheart," Emmeline said, "but now people know the truth, and that makes us safer." "Does it?" Clara asked skeptically, "or does it just make him more angry?" "Both, probably," Emmeline admitted, "but we're not alone anymore." That evening, as the children settled down for the night, Johnny approached. Emmeline in Zeke's study, where she was securing the evidence documents in the strongbox. "There's something else," he said. "Something I never told you about Zeke." "What kind of something?" Johnny hesitated, then pulled a small key from his pocket. "The night before Zeke disappeared, he gave me this, told me if anything happened to him, I should wait until I was sure it was safe, then show it to whoever came to take care of us." Emmeline took the key, examining it closely. "What does it open?" "Follow me," Johnny said, leading her to the far wall of the study where a large bookcase stood. He reached behind one of the volumes, and Emmeline heard a soft click. Suddenly, the entire bookcase swung inward, revealing a hidden room. "Zeke built this when he first came here," Johnny explained, lighting a lamp to illuminate the secret space. "Said a man needed a place to keep his most important things safe." The hidden room was small but well organized, with shelves lining the walls and a desk. In the center, Johnny used his key to open a locked drawer in the desk, revealing documents that made Emmeline gasp. "Land deeds," she breathed, examining the papers, dozens of them. "Zeke had been buying up property for years," Johnny explained, "using different names, shell companies, things I don't really understand, but he owned way more land than anyone knew, including most of what Fairweather thinks belongs to him." Emmeline studied the documents with growing amazement. Zeke had been far more than just a simple rancher. He had been building a business empire that rivaled Fairweather's own, and doing it quietly, carefully, and completely legally. "There's more," Johnny said, pulling out another set of papers. "Contracts with railroads, mining, companies' plans for development that would have made this whole valley worth a fortune." "Fairweather knew," Emmeline said, understanding flooding through her. "Somehow he found out what Zeke was doing and realized it threatened his own plans." "That's what I figure," Johnny said. "Zeke was beating him at his own game and doing it honest." Emmeline continued examining the documents, finding evidence of Zeke's careful planning and strategic thinking. He had been positioning himself to challenge Fairweather's dominance of the valley, but had been killed before he could reveal his hand. "Johnny," she said slowly, "do you understand what this means? That we're richer than we thought. More than that." Emmeline said, "This gives us the power to finish what Zeke started, to build the kind of community he envisioned, where families like ours can thrive without fear. But only if we can stay alive long enough to use it." It was a sobering thought, but Emmeline felt something she hadn't experienced since Thomas's death back in Pennsylvania, a sense of purpose that went beyond mere survival. Zeke had given her more than just children to care for. He had given her a mission. "There's one more thing," Johnny said, reaching into the back of the drawer. "Zeke wrote this the night he gave me the key." He handed her a letter addressed in Zeke's careful handwriting, "To the woman who answers my advertisement." Emmeline opened it with trembling fingers. "My dear Emmeline," she read aloud, "if you are Reading this then, I am gone, and my worst fears have come to pass. I have tried to build something worthwhile in this valley, something that could provide security and hope for the children I have gathered, and for the woman brave enough to join. Her life to mine, I pray that woman is you. She paused, swallowing hard before continuing. I know I deceived you about the children, and I am sorry for that. But I could not bear to lose you before you had a chance to know them, to see what I see. In their courage and resilience, they have made me a better man, and I believe they will do the same for you. The letter went on to detail Zeke's suspicions about Fairweather and his fears for the future. I have tried to be careful, but I fear I may have underestimated my enemy. If something happens to me, the children will need someone strong enough to protect what I have built and wise enough to use it for good. I pray that someone is you. The documents in this room represent years of work and planning. Use them well. Use them to build the kind of community where children like ours can grow. Up safe and loved where good people can prosper without fear of men like Silas Fairweather. The letter was signed simply, "With hope and faith, Ezekiel Mathers." Emmeline wiped tears from her eyes as she finished reading. He really did love you. All? She said to Johnny. Yeah. The boy said, his own voice thick with emotion, and he would have loved you too if he'd had the chance. As they closed the hidden room and returned the bookcase to its normal position, Emmeline felt the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders. She was no longer just a woman trying to protect 7 children. She was the inheritor of Zeke's dream and the guardian of his legacy. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. She had no doubt that Fairweather would strike back and strike hard, but tonight she felt something she hadn't felt in months, a sense of hope for the future. Johnny, she said, as they prepared to leave the study, tomorrow we start fighting back, not just to survive, but to win. You really think we can beat him? I think Zeke gave us the tools to do it, Emmeline said, and I think he chose well when he chose us to carry on his work. Outside, the wind howled across the Wyoming prairie, but inside the ranch house, 7 children slept peacefully under the protection of a woman who had finally found her purpose and the strength to pursue it. The attack came 3 days later, just before dawn, when the first light was creeping over the mountains. Emmeline woke to the smell of smoke and Johnny's urgent voice calling her name. She rushed to the window and saw flames licking at the barn, while dark figures moved through the pre-dawn shadows. Get the children up, she told Johnny, grabbing Zeke's rifle from beside her. Bed, get them dressed and ready to run if we have to. The children responded with the practiced efficiency of those who had learned that survival meant quick obedience. Clara helped with the younger ones, while Samuel and Bethany gathered essential supplies. Johnny positioned himself at a front window with another rifle, watching the approaching figures. How many? Emmeline asked. Can't tell, maybe 6 or 7. Johnny's voice was steady despite his youth. They're trying to surround the house. A voice called out from the darkness. Miss Turner, come out, and we can settle this peaceable like. Emmeline recognized the voice of one of Fairweather's hired men. What do you want? She called back. Just want to talk about that property transfer. Mr. Fairweather mentioned, bring them papers you got and we can work something out. The papers are in town, Emmeline lied. Safe with people who know what to do with them if anything happens to us. There was a brief conference among the attackers. Then the voice called back, well then I reckon we'll just have to convince you to go fetch them. The barn was fully ablaze now, sending sparks toward the house on the wind. Emmeline realized they meant to burn them out, force them into the open, where they could be easily captured or killed. Can we get to the root cellar? She asked Johnny. Back doors blocked saw at least 2 men there, Johnny reported. But there's the tunnel. Emmeline had forgotten about the tunnel Zeke had dug from. The cellar to the old well house, a precaution against exactly this kind of situation. Get everyone down there, she ordered. I'll cover you. You should come with us. Clara said, her face pale but determined. Someone needs to make them think we're still up here, Emmeline said. Buy you time to get away. Then I'll stay too. Johnny said, "No." Emmeline's voice was firm. "The children need you more than I do. Get them to town to Maggie's shop. She'll know what to do." It was one of the hardest things she had ever done, watching the children disappear into the cellar, knowing she might never see them again. But she also knew it was the only way to keep them safe. She moved through the house, firing occasional shots out the windows to make the attackers think the family was still trapped inside. The smoke was getting thicker now, as sparks from the barn caught the roof of the house. Just as she was beginning to think she had waited too long, she heard the thunder of approaching hoofbeats and voices calling out from the road, "This is Sheriff Morrison. Drop your weapons and come out with your hands up." Emmeline felt a surge of hope. Sheriff Morrison was Fairweather's man, but perhaps the weight of public opinion had finally forced him to act. The gunfire from outside ceased, and she heard the sound of men mounting horses and riding away quickly, abandoning their attack when faced with official opposition. She emerged from the burning house, coughing and covered in soot, to find not just Sheriff Morrison, but a dozen townspeople, including Maggie Taylor and Henry the blacksmith, all armed, and grim-faced Miss Turner. Morrison said, his voice carefully neutral, "Are you hurt?" "No, but the children," she started, "are safe." Maggie interrupted. "Johnny brought them to town. We came as soon as we saw the fire." Emmeline felt her knees go weak with relief. "Thank you, all of you." "We should have come sooner," Henry said, looking at the burning buildings. "Should have stopped this before it started." Sheriff Morrison looked uncomfortable. "I'll need statements from everyone about what happened here tonight." "What happened," Maggie said sharply, "is that Silas Fairweather tried to burn out a woman and 7 children because she wouldn't sell him land that doesn't belong to him. Now, Maggie, you don't know it was Fairweather's men, don't I?" Maggie pulled a piece of cloth from her pocket. "Found this caught on the fence. One of them must have torn it climbing through." Morrison examined the fabric reluctantly. "This doesn't prove anything. Maybe not legally," Henry said, "but it proves enough for us." The next morning, Emmeline stood in the center of town, addressing a crowd that had gathered in front of the general. Store word of the attack had spread quickly, and people who had remained silent for years were finally ready to speak. "Silas Fairweather has terrorized this community long enough," she said, her voice carrying clearly in the crisp morning air. "He has murdered, stolen, and threatened, and we have let him do it because we were afraid. Fear is what he counts on," Maggie added. "Fear that keeps us isolated, keeps us from standing together." "But we're not isolated anymore," Henry said. "And we're not afraid." A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd, and Emmeline saw something she had never expected to see in the faces around her: courage, born not of desperation, but of righteous anger. "What do you propose we do?" asked Dr. Peterson, the town's physician. "We make it clear that Fairweather's reign of terror is over," Emmeline said. "We stand together and we protect each other. And if he comes after us," someone called out, "then he'll have to come after all of us." Emmeline replied, "And I don't think even Silas Fairweather is powerful enough for that." Sheriff Morrison pushed through the crowd, his face red with anger. "This is vigilante talk," he said. "You can't take the law into your own hands." "We're not taking the law into our own hands," Emmeline said calmly. "We're asking you to enforce it. There's no evidence that Fairweather was involved in last night's incident." "Then investigate," Henry said. "Do your job." Morrison's hand moved toward his gun, but the crowd pressed on closer, and he seemed to realize how outnumbered he was. "I'll investigate," he said finally, "but I won't have mob rule in this town." As the crowd began to disperse, Emmeline felt a hand on her shoulder and turned to find Johnny standing beside her, with the other children clustered around him. "The house is gone," he said simply. "Houses can be rebuilt." Emmeline replied, pulling him into an embrace. "Families are what matter." "So, what do we do now?" Clara asked Emmeline. looked around at the faces of the townspeople who had stood with her people, who had found their courage at last, and made a decision that would change everything. "Now we finish what Zeke started," she said. "We build something better." Fairweather's response came swiftly and brutally. Within hours of the town meeting, his men had destroyed the bridge leading to the railroad, cutting off the town's main supply route, and poisoned the well that served the eastern part of town. But instead of terrorizing the community, these acts only strengthened their resolve. Emmeline stood in Maggie's dress shop, which had become an unofficial headquarters for the resistance planning their next move, with a core group of allies. The children were upstairs being cared for by Maggie's sister while the adults worked. "He's getting desperate," Henry observed, studying a map of the area. "These are the actions of a man who knows he's losing control." "Desperate men are dangerous men," Dr. Peterson warned. "We need to be careful not to push him into doing something even more reckless than trying to burn us alive," Johnny said from his position by the window where he was keeping watch. "The boy has a point," Maggie said. "Fairweather has already shown he's willing to kill. What's to stop him from doing it again?" Emmeline had been thinking about this very question since the attack. "His reputation," she said finally. "His standing in the territorial government. He can't afford to be seen as a common criminal." "So we make sure he is seen," Henry said, understanding immediately. "We force him out into the open." "How?" Dr. Peterson asked. Emmeline pulled out a telegram she had received that morning. "The territorial governor is coming through on his inspection. Tour next week. He'll be staying at Fairweather's ranch." "Perfect opportunity," Maggie said. "If we could get evidence to him directly, or better yet, get Fairweather to incriminate himself in front of the governor," Emmeline said. "That's a dangerous game," Dr. Peterson warned. "If we're wrong, if the governor is in Fairweather's pocket, we'll all be marked for death." "We're already marked," Johnny pointed out. "At least this way we have a chance to win." The plan they developed was audacious and risky, but it was also their best hope of ending Fairweather's reign of terror. Once and for all, they would use the governor's visit to stage a confrontation, one that would force Fairweather to reveal his true nature in front of someone who had the power to stop him. "I'll need to get close to Fairweather," Emmeline said. "Make him think I'm ready to surrender." "That's suicide," Henry protested. "He'll kill you the moment he gets you alone." "Not if there are witnesses," Emmeline said. "Not if the governor is watching." "You're assuming the governor is honest," Maggie pointed out. "I'm assuming he's political," Emmeline corrected. "And politicians don't like being associated with murderers and thieves, at least not publicly." The next few days were spent in careful preparation. Emmeline practiced her role, rehearsing what she would say to draw Fairweather out, while the others positioned themselves around his ranch, ready to provide support. If things went wrong, Clara proved instrumental. In the planning, her knowledge of the ranch layout from her years with Zeke, allowing them to identify the best positions for witnesses and escape routes. "I want to come with you," the girl said, as they finalized their plans. "Absolutely not," Emmeline replied. "It's too dangerous." "Everything's dangerous now," Clara said. "At least if I'm there, I can help." "You can help by staying safe," Emmeline said firmly, "by making sure the younger children are protected if something happens to me." On the day of the governor's arrival, Emmeline rode alone to Fairweather's ranch, her heart hammering as she approached the imposing mansion that served as his headquarters. She could see the territorial flag flying from the porch and knew that Governor Mackenzie had already arrived. Fairweather met her at the door, his smile genuine for the first time since she had known him. "Miss Turner," he said, "I must admit I'm surprised to see you here. I've come to discuss terms," Emmeline said. "I think we can reach an accommodation." "How refreshing," Fairweather said. "Finally, a display of common sense. Please come in. The governor is eager to meet you." Governor Mackenzie was a small, dapper man with intelligent eyes and a politician's smile. He shook Emmeline's hand warmly when Fairweather introduced them. "Miss Turner," he said, "Mr. Fairweather has been telling him about your situation. I understand you've had some difficulties. Nothing that can't be resolved with goodwill on both sides," Fairweather said smoothly. "I'm glad to hear it. The governor said, territorial development depends on cooperation between neighbors." "Indeed," Emmeline said, "though I have to say some neighbors are more cooperative than others." The conversation continued over dinner, with Fairweather playing the gracious host while subtly pressuring Emmeline to accept his terms. She played her part, well appearing to weaken under the combined pressure of his threats and the governor's diplomatic intervention. "Perhaps," she said, as the meal concluded, "we could discuss the details privately, Mr. Fairweather." "Of course," Fairweather said, rising from the table, "if you'll excuse us, Governor." But as they moved toward his study, Emmeline made her move. "Actually," she said loudly enough for the governor to hear, "before we proceed, I think you should know about these." She pulled out copies of the documents Rufus had given her, spreading them on the dinner table where the governor could see them. "What are these?" Mackenzie asked, picking up one of the letters. "Evidence of Mr. Fairweather's business practices," Emmeline said, "including detailed instructions for the murder of my intended husband." Fairweather's face went white, then red with rage. "Those are forgeries," he snarled, "lies created by a vindictive woman." "In your handwriting," Emmeline pointed out, "with your signature." The governor studied the documents, his expression growing increasingly troubled. "These are very serious allegations, Mr. Fairweather. Allegations made by a woman who has no understanding of how business is conducted in this territory," Fairweather said, but his composure was cracking. "Business that includes murder," Emmeline pressed, "and theft and intimidation." "That's enough!" Fairweather exploded, his mask finally falling away completely. "You have no idea what you're interfering with what I've built here. I know exactly what you've built," Emmeline said, "an empire based on fear and violence." "Fear and violence are the only things that work out here," Fairweather snarled. "Civilized people like the governor here don't understand what it takes to tame a wilderness." "I understand enough," Mackenzie said quietly, "to know that territorial law applies everywhere, Mr. Fairweather, even here." The confrontation continued for another hour, with Fairweather growing increasingly agitated. As he realized that his carefully constructed facade was crumbling before his eyes, by the time it ended, there was no doubt in anyone's mind about his guilt. 2 months later, Emmeline stood on the porch of the new house, watching the children play. In the yard that had been cleared, where the old barn once stood, the structure was smaller than Zeke's original home. But it was theirs, built with help from the townspeople who had become not just allies, but friends. Governor Mackenzie had been true. To his word, Fairweather was in territorial custody, awaiting trial on charges of murder, fraud, and intimidation. Sheriff Morrison had been removed from office and replaced with Henry the blacksmith, who proved surprisingly effective at maintaining order. Rufus Gray had turned himself in and was cooperating with the territorial marshal. His testimony would ensure that Fairweather spent the rest of his life in prison if he escaped the hangman's noose. "Penny for your thoughts," Maggie said, joining Emmeline on the porch. "Just thinking about how much has changed," Emmeline replied. 6 months ago I was a spinster piano teacher in Pennsylvania. Now I'm a rancher and mother of 7 in Wyoming." "Any regrets?" Emmeline considered the question. Watching Johnny teach Willie how to throw a rope, while Clara helped Hannah with her letters. "None," she said finally, "not a single one." The sound of approaching horses drew their attention, and they looked up to see a rider coming up the lane, a stranger in a dark suit who dismounted and approached the porch with a formal bearing. "Miss Turner," he said, removing his hat, "I'm Attorney James Harrison from Cheyenne. I have some documents for you regarding the estate of Ezekiel Mathers." Emmeline's heart skipped. Estate. Mr. Mathers left very detailed instructions about the disposition of his property in the event of his death. Harrison explained, including provisions for the care of the children and the management of his business interests. As Harrison spread the legal documents on the porch table, Emmeline realized that Zeke's planning had been even more thorough than she had imagined. He had not only built a business empire, but had legally ensured that it would be protected and properly managed after his death. "You are named as sole beneficiary and guardian," Harrison explained, "with full authority to manage all properties and business interests on behalf of the children until they reach majority." "How much?" Emmeline asked faintly. "Conservative estimate," Harrison said, "approximately $200,000 in land and business assets." Maggie whistled softly. "That's more money than this town sees in 5 years. Mr. Mathers also left specific instructions about how the money should be used," Harrison continued. "Establishment of a school, improved medical facilities for the town, and provisions for other families in need." Emmeline felt tears pricking her eyes as she realized the full scope of Zeke's vision. He had not just been building wealth, but laying the foundation for a better community. "There's one more thing," Harrison said, pulling out a sealed envelope. "He left this for you personally." With trembling fingers, Emmeline opened the letter and read Zeke's final words to her, words of hope and faith. In the future they could build together, even if he was not there to see it. "My dearest Emmeline," the letter began, "if you are reading this, then you have proven yourself to be everything I hoped you would be, and more. You have protected the children, faced down our enemies, and begun to build the kind of community where love can flourish without fear." The letter went on to detail his dreams for the valley and his faith that she would be able to realize them. "I know I asked much of you, perhaps too much, but I also knew that you had the strength to bear it. The children are lucky to have found you, as am I, even if only in spirit. Use this inheritance wisely." The letter concluded, "Not just for your own family, but for all the families who will come after. Build something lasting, something worthy of the love you have shown my children and they have shown you." As the sun set behind the mountains, Emmeline gathered the children around her on the porch and told them about their inheritance, about the future that was now possible because of Zeke's foresight and sacrifice. "Does this mean we're rich?" Samuel asked, his eyes wide. "It means we're secure," Emmeline said. "It means we can build the kind of life Zeke wanted for all of us." "And we'll stay together?" little Hannah asked. "Forever," Emmeline promised, pulling the little girl into her lap. "We're a family now. Nothing will ever change that." Later that evening, after the children had been put to bed, Emmeline sat in the parlor working on plans for the school Zeke had envisioned. Clara appeared in the doorway, holding baby Lily, who had grown into a bright toddler with an infectious laugh. "She was fussing," Clara explained. "I think she wanted to say good night." Emmeline took Lily into her arms, marveling at how natural it felt to hold this child who had come to her as a stranger, but was now as precious as if she had given birth to her herself. "Clara," she said, "do you ever think about what your life would have been like if Zeke hadn't taken you in?" Clara considered the question seriously. "Sometimes," she said, "but not the way you might think. I don't think about it, sadly. I think about it gratefully, because it makes me appreciate what we have." "And what do we have?" "Everything." Clara said simply, "We have everything that matters." As autumn turned to winter and winter gave way to spring, the Turner Ranch became a gathering place for families throughout the valley. The school opened with Clara as Emmeline's assistant teacher. The medical clinic was established with Dr. Peterson in charge, and slowly, steadily, the community Zeke had envisioned began to take shape. On a warm day in late spring, as Emmeline watched her children playing in the yard, she felt a presence beside her and turned to see Johnny, now 16 and tall for his age, standing with a letter in his hand. "What's that?" she asked. "Letter from back east," he said. "From my cousin, thought you should see it." Emmeline read the letter, which told of Johnny's remaining family members who had been searching for him since his parents' death and wanted him to return to live with them. "What do you want to do?" she asked. Johnny was quiet for a moment, watching his siblings playing. "I want to stay." He said finally, "This is my family. Now you're my family." "You're sure?" "I've never been more sure of anything," Johnny said. "Zeke gave us something precious when he brought us all together. I'm not going to walk away from that." Emmeline pulled him into an embrace, feeling her heart swell with pride and love. "Then we'll write back and tell them you're exactly where you belong." As the years passed, the children grew and thrived, each finding their own path while remaining connected to the family that had shaped them. Johnny became a successful rancher in his own right. Clara opened a school for girls in Cheyenne. Samuel became a horse trainer whose reputation spread throughout the territory. The younger children grew into confident, capable adults who carried forward the values of love, courage, and community that had been instilled in them by Zeke's vision and Emmeline's care. And Emmeline herself found a happiness she had never dared to dream of, not just in her role as mother, but as a leader in the community, a woman whose courage had helped break the cycle of fear and intimidation that had held the valley in thrall. On quiet evenings, she would sometimes sit on the porch and think about the strange journey that had brought her to Wyoming, the grief that had driven her west, the man she had never met, but whose love had shaped her life, and the children who had taught her that family was not about blood, but about choice. She had come to Wyoming as a mail-order bride seeking a new beginning. What she had found was something far more precious, a purpose, a family, and a love that would last forever. 10 years later, Emmeline stood at the window of the schoolhouse, watching her grandchildren play in the yard that had once echoed with the laughter of 7 orphaned souls. Clara had married Dr. Peterson and brought her children to visit, while Johnny ran the ranch with his wife, and Samuel's horse training business thrived across 3 territories. The valley had become everything Zeke envisioned, a place where families flourished, where children learned and grew in safety, where neighbors helped neighbors without fear. Emmeline touched the locket at her throat containing Zeke's photograph and smiled. She had found her purpose in the most unexpected way, transformed from a grieving woman into the mother of a community that would endure for generations. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.